And hello, everyone. It's really nice to be here talking to you about social value. I'm actually at Coventry Council this morning at a workshop on social value. And so it's a whole day about social value, and which makes me really happy. As Michael said, I'm Dr. Haley Beer, and I'm based at Warwick Business School, and I specialize in social value and social impact. And today I want to talk to you a little bit about getting the most out of social value measurement. And just to say a little bit about my background, I've been working in the space of social value and social impact since about 2007. I'm from Canada, and I come from a small town in Canada called Charlottetown in Prince Edward Island. And back then there was, in the early 2000s, there was no services for young people who were suffering from addiction and limited services for those with mental health issues. And so I did my undergraduate degree while also volunteering with these organizations, working also with some advisory committees in my province and nationally, and eventually came on to the concept of social enterprise. And this concept of doing business while doing good and all the charity work that I had been involved with led me to want to do research in this space. And so since then, I went on to do an honors with my undergraduate, looking at social enterprises in Kenya, and then moved to the United Kingdom to do my PhD at Warwick. And I've since been working with governments here in the UK. I've also worked in Chile and India. I worked with Coventry City of Culture on the impact evaluation component. I currently work with Spirit of 2012, and I do work with the OECD, of which one of the reports that I co-authored with them, I'll be talking to you about today. All of this background to say that I've been thinking about social value measurement and impact measurement for a long time. And one of the things that has always driven me in this space is that we should be able to do it in a way that supports and uplifts all of the social impact work that's going on, the social value momentum, rather than detract from it. And so my research has always been guided by this desire to understand how measurement can be used as a source of meaningfulness and a source of empowerment, rather than it feeling like a burden that gets added to the work of people that are already so busy doing so many things and wanting to work on social value. And so I hope to share a little bit of that with you today. All of that to also say that at the moment I use the term social value and social impact interchangeably. I realize that different councils define their social value in a different way. There's also the way that it's defined in the procurement legislation. However, I'm going to talk about it in a broad sense. Specifically, I want to talk to you about what we've discovered when we were writing the Measure, Manage, and Maximize Your Impact report. And this is a guide for the social economy that was co-authored with colleagues at the OECD. And the purpose of this was to say, how can we use impact measurement in a way that supports frontline organizations, public sector organizations, to promote and strengthen their social value creation possibilities? And we pulled from around the world examples of governments, but also social enterprises and NGOs, the work that they've been doing to measure their impact, but also utilize that data that they have about impact to create more impact and to adapt and to improve their interventions for impact. And so within this context, social impact measurement is the ways in which you leverage measurement to assess the social value produced by activities of, it can be a for-profit or a not-for-profit organization, but the point of assessing is really to start to understand how people's well-being is improved or changed, how the natural environment has evolved, and how much of that change can be attributed to any one organization's activities. And so in a broad sense, social impact measurement is all the ways in which we assess the social value of an organization, and really trying to get that additional net value that's created by social value. So going beyond traditional financial value to capture this more specific mission focused activities and the value that they add. And why does this matter? Well, of course, the more that we know about social impact and social value creation, the more that we can talk about the positive contribution that organizations are having to society, the more that that enables organizations to allocate resources to social value creation and social value measurement itself. But then also, when we have data and insights on our intervention, we can start improvising and experimenting and innovating on the types of innovations and the ways in which we engage with communities and societies to make a positive impact. And hopefully also through the use of measures, we gather data that allows us to persuade others to get involved, to ensure that more resources are put towards this type of work. And so this is what I mean when I say social impact. And I realize that different councils will practice this in more in diverse ways and have variations of how they define social value itself. But this is in general what I'm referring to throughout this webinar when I'm saying social impact and social value measurement. And so although we want to practice social value measurement and we are aware of the benefits, it's also enormously challenging. A lot of these challenges were mentioned today and are probably common to you, those of you on the webinar call who deal with social value as part of your role or would like to embed it more in your role. And so the availability of data that we would say represent social value is difficult. Standardizing metrics, and so ensuring that we can talk about social value in an agreed way is sometimes difficult, even between a council and local partners, for example, or sometimes between local partners and the beneficiaries that we're trying to target. We don't all necessarily define the value that's being created in the same way or see the same type of importance out of social value. So for some of us, it's connectedness. For some of us, it's reach of people, the amount of people that we engage. And for all these reasons, standardizing the metrics that we use for anything from cohesion to connectedness to digital inclusion, it varies. But there's a lot of times also a lack of scale and resources. And so what this is really trying to get at is that social value measurement and the strategic use of social value itself requires a certain set of skills that differ from traditional measurement. And so a lot of times we're used to doing things with key performance indicators and reports and templates, and social value measurement often pushes us to go further than that and to use qualitative data alongside quantitative data to build relationships in new ways, because it's not just a calculation that you can perform about the number of people or the carbon offsetting, but rather it requires you to get to know people and to hear from their experiences. And this is a certain set of skills and resources that not every organization already has in place. And then we know that there's other challenges about measuring even specific parts of social value, one of the most important perhaps being well-being, and well-being being defined differently around the world. For example, the subjective well-being can be different based on your age or the generation that you're in. And so this adds to the challenges of measuring social value. Then, of course, there's monetization. What value, whose value matters, and the reporting requirements that can often be so demanding that even just compiling the report that goes with social value takes all of the resources, leaving little time to learn from that report or to share it with stakeholders and to understand what to do better next time. And so the other part of measurement that becomes so difficult is that we know that it has unintended consequences. And so when we use measures to determine performance, we can end up gaming, so we can avoid the riskiest cases. We can do only that which is necessary to hit the targets, to keep the funding. We can manipulate information. There can be selective attention. And so if you have only a couple KPIs for a project, maybe you focus only on that and not the wider needs that are being declared or proposed. We can have the illusion of control so that we're controlling the outcome, and oftentimes where social value is concerned, especially people, then this is really out of our control. We can set many things in place so that we encourage and influence beneficiaries to transform and to benefit, but it is really outside of any one person's control whether or not that transformation occurs. It's up to the person that is taking the service. And so this is a very different way understanding the world, then traditional measurement would have encouraged us to think that we can cause something to happen every time. It's really not the case with social value. But then, of course, obviously the administrative overload. And so it's very costly to do this type of work, especially where we get into qualitative types of measures and relationship building over time, or eventually longitudinal tracking of beneficiaries' progress becomes very expensive. And so regardless of all of these challenges that many of you will be aware of, there is emerging knowledge on what can be done to make it more accessible and amenable and beneficial to organizations that wish to measure their social value. And so this impact journey comes from the Measure, Manage, and Maximize report. As you can see, the steps in the journey echo the title. And this really summarizes the steps through which extant research being brought together, examples from around the world of social value measurement, from governments as well as social enterprises and NGOs on the front lines. Really, this is the steps that come out, the steps and the principles that come out as being most important to ensuring that you can use social value measurement to benefit your organization. And so I'm going to break them down here, but also walk through these with you over the next half an hour or so. And so the first part, of course, is to measure, but you need to design your measures, collect and analyze data, and learn and share. And then the middle element of this is, of course, to manage this data. And in order for the measures to have value for your organization, of course, they should be informing decision-making. It should be part of your stakeholder engagement. They should inform and also be supported by appropriate skill development. There's an increasing use of digital tools for data that can enable this both stakeholder engagement and learning in novel ways. There should be a seeking of validation of some kind, but also action plans to follow up on learnings. And then the maximize part of impact is really exemplified by 6 guiding principles, which I'll introduce to you later. But so to start off then, in the measure part of this impact journey, we can see that each of the 3 components, design, collect and analyze data, and learn and share, are all surrounding the engage the stakeholders and manage stakeholder engagement. And this really comes down to the fact that social value measurement requires a lot of reflection and consultation and deliberation with those individuals that we're trying to help in order to understand why we would choose one intervention versus another, to understand what's working and not working, and to understand why we would allocate resources in a certain way or bring people together in a certain forum. And so in the design stage of the measure, what you really want to do is to start to translate the mission or the reasons for your social value into particular objectives. One of the ways of doing this, one of the most common ways, is using a change strategy model, one of which is the theory of change. And then you, once you have your objectives and you visualize them, you can identify the learning needs. So when it comes down to selecting measures, it's not just that we can measure something. It should always be that the measurement of that something is going to inform somebody's learning or accountability needs. And I will break this down even further, but the final part of this would then be to set impact targets around it. And so the collect and analyze data stage is, of course, about making sure that you're picking the right methods to collect data that would allow you to have access to the accountability and learning needs that you're hoping to gain from having that measure in place. It's about, of course, then collecting and analyzing the data with those methods and, where necessary, valuing the impacts of the monetization. And the third component of the measurement journey is this learn and share, which for me, I really believe is the most important, is at the heart of using social value measurement in a beneficial way. And this is because it's where you take time to use the data that you've collected to learn, to be accountable with your stakeholders, whether that's your senior managers or the beneficiaries or your partners. It's where you use the qualitative and quantitative evidence collectively to tell a story, to see the nuances, and it's where you communicate what you've been up to. And so I'm going to go in a little bit further into each of these subcomponents and some of the key activities that you can do to fulfill them. And so in the design stage, then one of the major ways of translating your mission into particular objectives is to create a change strategy. One of my favorite models for this is the theory of change. I use Ibrahim and Rangan. I do have access and would gladly share the article for anybody that wants it. But an overview of their approach is that a theory of change allows you to talk about the how and the why change is supposed to happen. Of course, with social value, we're trying to target an improvement in the conditions of people's lives, or knowledge or attitudes or access. And so this theory of change is asking organizations to describe why they think one intervention would help versus another. But the theory of change is not the only model you can use. There's logic models, impact maps, outcome harvesting. All of those are described in the original report. For those that are interested, there's templates also that you can follow. But the second part of this is that once you've been able to describe the change that is going to happen, or the change that you assume will happen if you use your resources for certain activities with certain groups, then you can talk about particular objectives. And these objectives is what actually helps you understand what's best to measure. And once you have specifics of what you're going to measure based on your objectives, then you can monitor and adapt and learn from those. And so here is a template of a theory of change. This is one way in which you could visualize it. I could spend an entire hour just talking about how to create these in multiple examples. So this is just going to be a bit of a whirlwind stop on what they are and to really accentuate the point of how you could use one of these to get at some of the objectives that you would measure. But a theory of change asks you to talk about the resources that you need to deliver. So on any specific project, which resources do you need in terms of equipment, staff, volunteers, space, locations, in order to deliver the products and services that will create change? What activities do you need to instigate the course of change? And the outputs, outcomes, and impacts are different layers of where value is created. And this is because oftentimes with social value, when we're trying to influence somebody's well-being, for example, whether that's through an art class or a gym class, or some training for educational purposes, oftentimes the change doesn't happen immediately. So the output describes the number of people that took the class or participated in the physical activity, or created an artwork. But this is the outputs is the direct numbers that participated or engaged or what was produced. Another example is, of course, the number of people that were vaccinated. This is the output. Whereas the outcome, the next box over, this is really getting at what changed. And so a lot of projects stop at outputs and don't get all the way to outcomes. And this is often due to resources and time. But the outputs is really just the immediate what happened when you used your resources with those activities. The outcomes moves you on to really thinking about what the benefits were for individuals or groups, what changed. And this can be attitude, skills, behavior. So it could be well-being that changed. It could be physical state. In the case of vaccines, of course, you would hope that the outcome was that there was a reduction in the amount of people that suffered with the disease. Another outcome from an educational training program could, of course, be improved whatever the training was about, whether that was budgeting, so improved budgeting. Maybe it was training specific to getting some employment, and so it would be number of people that got work. But the outcomes start to talk about the change, and this is different than the outputs. And then the impact in Ibrahim's model, this is really about the root cause effect. And so if, for example, you're a team that works with homelessness or with addiction in a certain group, the impact would eventually be the overall total reduction in homelessness or addiction in an area. This is often very hard to measure by any one organization, given that multiple organizations in a city or a region would deal with something like homelessness and addiction or inclusion. And so I would always recommend that if you're going to measure impact, you consider who your stakeholders, your partners are, and collectively try to measure the impact. But so when you write out the intent that you have for change for a given project, then you're really able to then say what you should measure, because what you should measure should be related to each of the boxes on the theory of change. You don't necessarily have to call it a theory of change or present it in a linear manner. So there's variations of this. There's the wheel of change you can see, the story of change, which plays around a little bit with the labels. Some of these can be really helpful when you're trying to engage beneficiaries in the process. A theory of change can be quite a mouthful, whereas a wheel of change or a story of change can be more inviting, or so people have found. And so there's variations of how you present it and how you build it. And then some objectives, some ideas for how you can talk about the particularities of the objective. So once you know what you're going to measure in terms of resources and activities and outputs and outcomes, you can start to talk about what part of it you want to change. And so it can be positive or negative. It could be an increase or decrease in something. It's about who experiences it. And so you can talk about particular geographic locations. You can talk about this based on postcode or maybe socio-demographic or behavioral characteristics, certain groups of society. You want to start to talk about how much of the outcome you're intending to generate. So it could be by how many people, the depth or degree, so a percentage change, and the duration. How long should this last, or at what moment should it emerge? And then contribution becomes much more complex. It's not always possible. It depends on how much resources you have for doing social value. But there's the difference between trying to determine contribution in terms of a counterfactual, so a randomized control trial, which would prove that your intervention is what absolutely caused the change, or you can talk about it in terms of attribution, which means in all likelihood, with this group of people that undertook your intervention, this intervention is what caused the change. But that really comes down, the ability to determine what form of contribution you're claiming also matters based on your methods, which I will also elaborate on a bit more in a bit. And so here's an example about a theory of change that this one's from the Heart Foundation, and it's for their work with reducing childhood obesity. Sorry. And you can see here that they've labeled their inputs and activities, and outputs become very specific. So it's about 5 community gardens, the 30% of trained teachers, sustaining community gardens, so what I like about this example is that it shows both objectives in terms of increase. So if they're going to reduce childhood obesity, they want to increase consumption of fruit and vegetables among children, but it also shows that decrease is part of impact. So decrease consumption of foods in high fat, salt, and sugar. And in this case, they link all of the components, but I won't go through everything, just to show that this is one example where the mission is very clear. The assumptions for change, what inputs and activities will lead to changes, both in the immediate and longer term, and it shows the specific types of objectives that you can use. And so then once you've decided this, once you have your theory of change or your change narrative, and you've got some specific impact objectives, the changes that you are intending to seek with particular groups, then before you actually pick a measure, a form of measuring something, you want to talk about the accountability versus learning needs. And what do I mean by this? What I mean is that measures play different purposes. And so the way that we measure something and the type of data that we collect on it determines what we can do with it later. And oftentimes we're used to talking about using measures for accountability. And so in accountability, we would be looking for effectiveness and efficiency. Effectiveness is the impact or the social value being achieved, to what extent, what difference is it making? And efficiency, of course, how well are resources being used to deliver economic and social value? Will this change last? But also where social value is concerned, we also want to support or introduce measures which support learning. And learning, on the other hand, is about relevance and coherence. And relevance is about using data to understand whether the interventions that are in place are the right ones for the stakeholder group. Are the stakeholders responding the way that you intended? Is there negative unintended consequences that are stemming from the work that you are doing? But also coherence. And so in most social value work, we will be working with individuals who have many opportunities to do social value work, especially with a council. One person could have multiple touch points with any one council, and social value data should help you determine whether these are coherent. Are individuals receiving services that complement one another? Is it duplicative? How could they better complement one another to enable better outcomes? And so every time that we are deciding what to measure for a social value project, we want to sort of decide which one of these or how many of these are a priority for us. And if you know why you want to collect information on a measure and what you would use it for, so what the data is going to be used to prove or to learn about, then it's much easier to pick the right method. And one of the ways that you can go about deciding this accountability versus learning needs is to also consider your stakeholders and to do some sort of stakeholder map. So this is a common stakeholder map that looks at stakeholder prioritization based on their interest in the program. So how interested are they in this project, but also their influence. So how much are they able to influence either your access to resources or the outcomes in some way. And as you can see, based on where you would put these stakeholder groups, and so for social value projects, that's often managers, employees, customers, beneficiaries, competitors, suppliers, the public sector legislation, social enterprises, investors, local communities. It is unlikely that every one of these stakeholders, you will be able to meet their needs with the data that you collect. But based on where the project is at any given time, it will be more apparent whose needs are most important. And so sometimes this is about donors and investors and needing to be able to be accountable to them so that they continue to support you, or that you can pitch this to your senior managers. And so this might encourage you to use more monetization, proxy-based types of methodologies that allow you to talk about the social value in a way that responds to donors' needs or investors' needs. Whereas sometimes it is more about the employees on the front lines and their ability to understand whether or not the intervention is the appropriate one, to what extent they should continue doing what they're doing or adapt, maybe even move to a different stakeholder group or beneficiary group. But oftentimes that involves more qualitative, case-based interviewing types of data. And so if you have a map of the stakeholders and their needs in terms of measurement, and also a prioritization of those needs, it's much easier to decide then which measures you pursue and why you would pursue them. And then just a little bit of a list of the ways in which you can use measures for accountability versus measures for learning. And so I've gone over many of these, but oftentimes the measuring for accountability, to be able to prove your work, to justify the investment, to establish that you're meeting regulatory and safeguarding requirements, often that part of it outweighs the measurement for learning. And I do see this all the time in social enterprises, in corporates, in public sector, that the measuring for learning gets less attention and less budget. But then even though there is budgetary constraints, I always recommend as much as possible to introduce some measurement for learning in the mix, because this is where you really are able to experiment with the different approaches. You're able to determine what's working and not working. It helps you evaluate the interventions, but it's also highly rewarding and motivating for those that are involved in the social value work. And increasingly, we're able to pinpoint that when people are able to use measurement for learning about the tasks that they do directly, this is what helps avoid the unintended consequences and actions that we see common with other forms of measurement, like gaming and manipulation. So measurement for learning is really important, even if it makes the process sometimes more expensive. So a balance between those is ideal. And so once you know what you want to measure and why you want to, once you know your objectives that you want to measure and why, which part of them you want to measure and why, then you can move on to data collection and analysis. An element of this is, of course, to set the baseline. So you need to know what has changed, and you can pick measures that allow you to ideally look at something pre and post an intervention. So if we keep going with the well-being example, you would like some form of being able to tell where the beneficiary group's well-being was before the intervention and then after. With the City of Culture work, we of course looked at things like number of jobs in the creative industry before and after City of Culture. We looked at well-being scores before and after certain interventions or activities or events. But then the ways that you can look at the pre, that varies. And so to have a baseline, sometimes you can use historical approach. And so different councils have different data on their citizens, household surveys, or data banks, which show over time certain conditions of the population. So that is often a great place, but there's also national databases that are collected that can be used. You can use publicly available data to compare. You can use norms or standards like the UN and OECD, the Sustainable Development Goals, for example, or you can diagnose the situation and need based on a project by project basis. But these are all options that you can use for baselining. This is just an example of the way that that was done for City of Culture in the beginning, but you can see that there's in the baseline value column, there is the household survey was often used to determine the ways in which citizens were currently engaging with the city, but also with cultural interventions. And the 2016 household survey was compared with the 2022 household survey. So this is one way in which you can baseline, but depending on which city and council that you're in, the type of data or the types of data banks will likely be different. And then once you have this baseline or this idea of where you're starting from and where you'd like to get to, you can pick your indicators and tools. This is really just a graph that tries to depict that there's many ways in which we can evidence social value. Indicators are highlighted because they're often what we fall back on. But if we were able to categorize this spectrum, we have very heavy quantitatives on one side and more qualitative on another. Quantitative, the most quantitative can be costly, social return on investment or randomized control trials. Other forms of cost-benefit analysis are quite costly, whereas qualitative tend to be less costly because those involves narratives and photos. It can be objects that beneficiaries have collected. You can move up in the sophistication of these, so case studies and storyboards and blogs. And then in the middle, we have things like indicators and outcome measurement specific tools like the outcome star. And what we know from longer term studies of the way data is used, that quantitative are more used for evidence-based decision making. People are more confident in using quantitative methods for evidence-based decision making, even though qualitative is a form of evidence-based decision making. We're used to the quantitative, but qualitative tends to be more emotionally convincing. And so different quantitative measures of results, we can use standardized options. They're seen as validated and credible. They're easier to baseline and compare, and they can be translated into an economic or monetized value. This is why they tend to be used more for evidence-based decision-making, whereas qualitative measures of results, these are better able to provide context behind the problem or what is changing. It can illustrate the change that is happening or what's preventing it. The narratives that are provided by qualitative data also can inspire people to connect to social problems. They can provide understanding of the rationales and reflections that key stakeholders have, their experiences of the program, why they got involved, why they left the program early, why they decided that they maybe didn't want to join after all. It can communicate abstract ideas in accessible ways, and it can help people talk about complex social issues in a community or a population. And it helps talk about the strengths and weaknesses of different programs. And so qualitative data ultimately is supportive of a learning learning outcomes, the learning needs of measurement, because it allows people to look at the nuances of how a project is unfolding. And so although it could be reductionist to say that you need quantitative and qualitative data in order to be able to support accountability and learning needs, at the foundation of it all, in a way, you do need both. So qualitative is more supportive of your learning needs. It does help staff on the front lines better understand what's happening and why and with whom. It can also help beneficiaries themselves reflect on and understand their progress, their transformations, what's blocking them. Things like the outcome star are great for that, but also tailored case studies where you're prompting them to reflect on very specific components of the program over time. If you collect lots of case studies from beneficiaries that have written it themselves directly to specific prompts, it becomes very easy to see the patterns in what's working and not working for different individuals. And so this data it becomes really strong when you're trying to learn from social value. Whereas the quantitative data is very strong in terms of proving and evidencing that an impact has been created, and tends to be what is still most commonly used when it comes to making a decision about allocation of funds. And so ideally both are there, both quantitative and qualitative would support accountability and learning needs. And so then the next part of this is really about the learn and share. And this part of the measure journey really leads you into the next step in the process, which is about managing your data, managing the social impact data. So once you have designed your measures, collected this data, and analyzed this data, it's time to consult and verify this with stakeholders and to use it to improve. And while you are learning and sharing about this data in specific ways with your stakeholders, you're also managing the social value process. And so this is a very important part of moving towards being able to grow and amplify the social value part of your components of your organizations and strategies. And so when it comes to consulting and verifying with stakeholders, there's different ways of doing this, but typically we've relied on things like financial audits. And so we have a particular group of people, regulators or managers, that would oversee our reports, our KPIs, our outcomes, and say whether or not it's credible and reputable, and you can use it to prove what you've done, whether they agree that this is the performance that you were looking for. But we now know that there's also this experiential verification where you can take what you're saying has occurred, you can take what you're saying is success or progress, and talk about it with those that have been involved in the project. So do the stakeholders, whether that's your partners or the beneficiaries or close contacts of the beneficiaries, do they agree with the results saying that well-being has changed, that attitudes have changed, that perceptions of a city has changed, and taking this data out to them and engaging with them about whether or not they agree or whether they see something different is a huge opportunity for learning and growth and adaptation moving forward. But in order to really do the stakeholder inclusion appropriately, you do want to make sure that you have representatives of relevant groups. You do want to talk about the main issues that matter, and this often means not shying away from what went wrong, what the weaknesses are. And it's very important to social value creation processes that there's an opportunity for people to talk about their complaints or the spaces where they did feel left out. And so you need generative conversation. It has to be about dialogue and deliberation. And at the end of the day, we still hope that it's actionable, that you're using it to inform decision making. And so what will be taken away from the consultations with stakeholders? How will this shape future programs, future funding, future actions, future processes? All of this is how you consult and verify with your stakeholders. And then if you want to use it to improve, there's a few things that you can start to do with the data. In addition to verifying it with your stakeholders and reflecting on what they say, you can also embed it into your governance structures. So you can have strategic meetings about impact. Impact can be on the agenda of high-level senior meetings, impact or social value. But the more that it's inbuilt into the everyday considerations of an organization, the more likely it is that you're going to pick up on things that you can improve. It's also about helping different organizational teams and individuals reflect on the social value that they're creating, how they feel about doing this work. This can also really often help in avoiding burnout and identifying ways in which teams need more support. Again, it's about talking about the issues and gaps and problems just as much as it is about talking about success. And then, of course, you want to make changes to the interventions where necessary. And so just because a developer or a partner likes to do certain work with a community, if it's been identified that that community is not benefiting in the way that it's intended, the hope would then be that you work with them to shape what it is that you do the next time and to change your interventions and to adapt along the way. But then the second part of this is that beyond just the organization and the projects themselves, there's some ecosystem structures. And so this is about talking with partners, related delivery organizations about what's going on, organizing events where internal and external stakeholders involved in social value projects can talk about these successes as well as points of failure or potential weaknesses, offer lots of opportunity for feedback, and wherever possible, also sharing data at an industry or target area. And so I think there's lots of work to be done to share data within councils about the social value work that's going on. But eventually, if there was ways of talking about even anonymized data across councils about the social value interventions and their results with different populations, that would enormously help to grow the possibilities for social value creation. And some things that can help are data repositories and open access. So there's one called Indigo about government-based outcomes. This one's hosted by Oxford. They talk about lots of the social impact bond outcomes by governments around the world, but they hold great case studies and measures for anybody that's looking for particular social issues that they're facing. This greatly helps the conversation about the best ways to target groups as well as how to measure success. And then just a couple other things around how you can design measures so that it supports the people doing this social value work, often that want meaningfulness out of their work, that are doing this because it's helping them contribute to the good in society. It helps them attach their role to doing something positive. And so if we're going to measure the work that these people do, we don't want it to be a burden. Of course, we want it to support them in their capacities to do good and to inform this work. And in some studies that we've done, one of the things that matters a lot about whether or not you can measure and influence their ability to experience their work as meaningful is that the measure that you're asking somebody to collect data on, it should be related to their specific tasks, because this helps them become efficient and effective in what they're doing. We don't just want to allocate measures to people just to have access to the measure. The more that the people that are collecting the data and reporting the data can themselves use the data to do something different in their role, the more likely they're able to get practical meaningfulness out of it. As much as possible, it should be allocated to people that allows them to see the impact of their work. And so oftentimes when we're just counting the number of people that attended a session or received a good, we're missing out on the change that occurred for those individuals. And this doesn't necessarily allow people at the front line to see how their work makes a difference to somebody's well-being or educational journey or sense of mental health. And so the more that we can introduce measures that capture outcomes, the more that we're able to support the people on the front lines doing that work. And finally, another big important part is about the relations along the lines of measures. And so when we involve people in data collection and data sharing, we can sometimes just ask for the data and not involve them in discussions about what should happen next and for whom and why. And this can really lead to people feeling silenced, versus when there is sharing and exchange, people feel respected and part of the process. And so these practical, existential, and relational ways that we design measures matter a lot for the ways in which people feel supported to create social value. There's just some tips on communicating it. So how it aligns with your values, the importance of the issue, the motives for addressing it, the impact on the issue itself, and the ongoing commitment. the reason why these points are so important in the messaging of the social value you created is that it allows you to tell a consistent and coherent narrative about why you're doing what you're doing, what effect it has had, and how you will change over time. I've put up just a picture of some reports from the Purpose Coalition. They do this really well in all of their reports, so I can signpost you there to go look at some great examples of how you do this. And then finally, in order to maximize your impact through all this measurement and management, you also want to keep these principles in mind. And so it is about having the mission as a narrative of change. It's about putting stakeholders at the center. It's about doing this proportionally. And so getting benefits out of measures, not just measuring for the sake of measuring, taking a holistic understanding of impact, capturing the positive and the negative, upholding transparency, so being real about the things that are learned along the way and the adaptations that were made, but also striving for continuous improvement. And so the social value data that you collect should absolutely help you improve as an organization in the way that you deploy resources, in the way that you partner and engage stakeholders, and in the types of interventions that you're introducing. And so with all of this, then with the measuring, managing, and maximizing your impact, this over the long run is what can support a strong social value strategy and creation. And so this is what I wanted to share with you today. I'm going to leave my email here. I'm very happy to talk to others dealing with social value challenges, these and others. I'd love to hear from people who have also saw some solutions to some of these challenges or who are well on their way of implementing in this way. But yeah, thank you very much.